get us started. Thank you all for joining us today. This is a joint event between League of Conservation Voters and Center for American Progress. I'm Nick Abraham. I'm LCV State Communications Director. And today's event is part of a joint series called State House to the White House, where we have discussed innovative policies at the state level that really set a national blueprint. We're really excited today about our three speakers and the policies they will discuss. States across the country have led the fight for environmental justice, and we believe the three recent past examples highlight the growing concern and focus on environmental justice across the country and represent key examples at a critical time for Congress as they're discussing climate and environmental policies. So without further ado, first up today we have Olivia Glenn, who is New Jersey's Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Justice and Equity under Governor Murphy. And she will be discussing New Jersey's new cumulative impact law, which is the first of its kind environmental justice bill to protect communities from aggregate pollution impacts. And with that, Olivia, I'll let you kick us off.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Olivia Glenn, the Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Justice and Equity at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And I want to thank both the National and New Jersey League of Conservation Voters and the Center for American Progress for inviting me to participate in this event. As the DEP's Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Justice and Equity, I am proud to be leading the department's effort to aid overburdened communities throughout New Jersey and to bolster diversity, equity, and inclusion within our own department, as well as assisting other state agencies. I'd like to talk a little bit about why environmental justice is so important. Since the civil rights movement of the 1960s, grassroots communities nationwide have documented disproportionate environmental burdens endured by poor communities and communities of color. Practices clearly embedded in racial injustice, such as redlining in housing and zoning, and the siting of highways and the consequential bifurcation of communities in the 1950s and 1960s, created environmental conditions and limited mobility that contributed to disparate negative public health outcomes. These included elevated blood lead levels, asthma, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and developmental problems, just to name a few. These communities also most often host potentially toxic facilities, such as landfills, incinerators, and other waste disposal entities that release potentially excessive pollutants. However, the disparities are not limited to air quality and facility siting. They are also reflected in land use and planning policies and are present in climate change impacts, water infrastructure, and flooding issues as we all contend with sea level rise. Addressing such inequities requires a collaborative approach. Government, community, and individuals working together. That is how the best progress is made. From the outset of his administration, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy has made environmental justice a top priority. In 2018, in his first 100 days in office, Governor Murphy issued an environmental justice executive order that did three things. First, it continued the Environmental Justice Advisory Council of 18 key stakeholders from groups around the state. Second, it created an Environmental Justice Interagency Council with representatives from across state government, state agencies, to work together in a collaborative fashion to advance environmental justice priorities. And finally, it directed our department at DEP to lead the development of a guidance document for all state agencies to integrate environmental justice into their decision-making so that we can all move forward with a whole of government approach to tackle some of our most challenging problems. That document, called Furthering the Promise, is our shared direction to address environmental justice holistically, incorporating both disparate environmental and public health stressors, as well as the lack or absence of environmental and public health benefits in many overburdened communities. In addition to the executive order, in partnership with the New Jersey Attorney General's Office, this administration has filed more than 30 legal actions to address pollution problems in environmental justice communities. The DEP's dedication to equity makes us particularly proud that we collaborated with community organizations, our legislature, and our governor to pass New Jersey's environmental justice law, the nation's first, and it was enacted in September 2020. This first in the nation environmental justice law seeks to remedy the historic injustice experienced by low-income and minority communities, as well as those with limited English proficiency, that during the past 50 years of modern environmental law have borne a disproportionate burden of the pollution that we all together create. The law recognizes that because environmental standards are often formulated based on the effect that pollution has on general populations spread over wide geographic areas, such standards did not fully consider the impacts that certain pollution generating facilities have on their local communities. That failure created pockets of high pollution across New Jersey, particularly because many pollution generating facilities are concentrated in those predominantly minority and low income communities. And they lack the financial and political power to shape their local landscape and avoid disproportionate adverse impacts on public health and the environment. The facilities that are considered within the law include major sources of air pollution, such as gas-fired power plants and cogeneration facilities, as well as resource recovery facilities or incinerators, sludge processing facilities, certain sewage treatment plants, transfer stations or solid waste facilities, some recycling facilities, and scrap metal facilities and landfills. The law does not go into effect until rules are adopted, and we anticipate that adoption in early 2022. In the meantime, we have engaged in robust stakeholdering with business and industry, as well as with environmental justice advocates, environmentalists, social organizations, and our municipalities. When our rules are promulgated, we plan to use the best science to protect New Jersey's most vulnerable populations in a way that is meaningful and institutionalized. The New Jersey Environmental Justice Law also gives residents of these communities, our overburdened communities, a say in what happens in their neighborhoods, and adding Black and Brown voices only enriches the conversation. The communities of focus in this legislation are those with census block groups that are at least 35% low income, 40% minority, or 40% limited English proficient. And only one of those criteria has to be met. And so for New Jersey, that encompasses 331 of our 565 municipalities. And I will be happy to share a link to our Overburdened Communities mapping tools in our chat. So in addition to our efforts with the environmental justice law, I want to just give a big shout out to our governor who enabled New Jersey to rejoin the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI for short. And so in February of this year, Governor Murphy announced the release of $100 million in RGGI and Volkswagen settlement funds to support environmental justice communities, local governments, private industry, ports, light and heavy duty charging infrastructure, school buses, New Jersey transit buses, and e-mobility in our state. Nearly $69 million in grants are being awarded for projects involving transportation electrification and electric vehicle charging stations that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and smog causing pollutants, and are focused in communities, some of our largest municipalities, such as Newark, Elizabeth, and Camden. Of those funds, $27 million is set aside to reduce transportation sector emissions being provided through the RGGI proceeds. By directing these funds toward greenhouse gas reductions, we also are helping New Jersey move forward on the path to a future that includes 100% clean transportation. In cities and towns around New Jersey, the funding will pay for bus electrification projects, electric school buses, shuttle buses, and garbage trucks. The dollars will also go toward e-mobility options in low and moderate income communities. In facilities such as Port Newark, Port Elizabeth, and Newark Liberty International Airport, and at the South Jersey Port Corporation in Camden, the funding will support the purchase of electric moving and handling equipment. And on roads that cross the state, The grants will finance the installation of fast charging stations for electric vehicles. We are truly excited about all these efforts. In water, the environmental justice law and our clean energy efforts are just two of our key areas where we're working to improve the quality of life for our residents. We're also working on New Jersey drinking water infrastructure. New Jersey has significant water infrastructure challenges, and the DEP has committed the expertise and seed money to address these issues, facilitating more than $1.7 billion in water infrastructure improvements to help enhance our water resources and protect public health. In conclusion, for far too long, the voices of our environmental justice communities have gone unheard and unheeded. These communities have shouldered more than their fair share of pollution and environmental hazards, and have often limited access to open space and nature. The environmental justice law and the executive order ensure that our communities have a strong voice about what happens in their neighborhoods and will make businesses accountable for the construction they desire and the actions they take. But again, the work of environmental justice cannot just be the responsibility of a state agency. We all have to work together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Glenn. Yeah, it's been so exciting to see what's happening in New Jersey. Y'all have made so much progress in such a short amount of time, and I know you are a huge part of why that has happened. So we're going to move right along here. And next we have James Povijua, who's Policy Director at the Center for Civic Policy in New Mexico. And he'll be discussing the state's clean energy transition and how the state is ensuring ensuring that New Mexico invests in and includes frontline communities in that transition. And with that, I'll kick it off to you, James.
Thank you, Nick, and good afternoon. As was stated, my name is James Povijua, which is spelled P as in Paul, O, V as in Victor, I, J-U-A, and I am the Policy Director for the nonpartisan New Mexico-based Center for Civic Policy. We convene the Power for New Mexico Coalition, which I will speak about in a moment. I am also a proud member of Okeowinge Pueblo, which is one of the many federally recognized Native American tribes in the great state of New Mexico. I am also very happy to be here with my co-panelists, Olivia and Alyssa, leaders who are leaders in climate and environmental justice. And I'm so happy to be in the company of other Black, Indigenous people who are getting the work that needs to be done. Center for Civic Policy serves as the convener of the New Mexico Civic Engagement Table, the largest 501c3 progressive advocacy hub in our state. We work to ensure broad and inclusive civic engagement among New Mexico's diverse and underrepresented communities through policy work, voter engagement, and issue education campaigns. With our partner organizations, our advocacy efforts span across various policy areas, which include inclusive democracy, immigrant rights, early childhood education, workers' rights, reproductive justice, economic justice, conservation, the environment, and climate equity. And our work is often at the intersections of these various policy buckets. Today, I would like to talk about advocacy efforts that led to the creation of the New Mexico Sustainable Economy Task Force and laid the groundwork to ensure bold policies to address climate change and energy transition that look beyond the energy sector are passed. Today, I would also like to talk about how policymakers and advocacy organizations can ensure that communities benefit from the jobs and economic growth provided in a clean energy future. In doing so, I will highlight the advocacy efforts around New Mexico's House Bill 9, the Climate Solutions Act, and other policy initiatives. Here is a good place to note that what is as important as developing and passing good policies is the process and the ways in which we can build power and agency for frontline communities around the country who are disproportionately impacted by the negative effects of the extractive industry and climate change. What I share today, I hope may be seen as a case study of how traditional environmental organizations have partnered and elevated the work of people of color, led community organizations in order to create policy that leads with equity. An example of such legislation, as I've said, was HB9, introduced during the 2021 New Mexico legislative session. This bill would have ensured that New Mexico would take bold action on climate change while creating workforce and economic development opportunities for our families. It would have done this by ensuring that historically disadvantaged communities have a seat at the table to envision a stronger and healthier New Mexico. This was an opportunity for our state to be a leader in developing an economic model that creates high quality jobs, makes full use of New Mexico's abundant renewable potential, and protects our precious limited water resources for present and future generations. In the end, HB9 did not pass, but the key components of just transition that created our state's Sustainable Economy Task Force did, and we have laid the foundation for the future passage of bold climate legislation that prioritizes the needs of frontline communities. Here now are some background on what it looks like on the ground in one of the largest oil and gas producing states in the country. New Mexico, the oil and gas industry, in New Mexico, the oil and gas industry contributes an average of $2 billion a year to the state, which is a significant sum considering that our state budget is on average $7 billion a year. New Mexico is a majority minority state and has the third highest poverty rate in the country. Just over 18% of the 2 million people living in our state live in poverty. In 2020, the state experienced the dual health and economic crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, with the added burden of the oil and gas market bottoming out. New Mexico, like the rest of the country and the rest of the planet, is already experiencing the impacts of climate change, including more frequent extreme heat days, worsening drought, diminished snowpack, and devastating wildfires. And air quality in our state has been significantly degraded, leading to chronic illness among the state's residents. So it's with this backdrop that I will speak about our efforts to win both long-term economic diversification in which all communities benefit and landmark climate policy. I believe that our efforts in this state are an important case study in what we should do as a country to center Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in combating global climate change. In 2019, our governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, with the support of a broad coalition of advocacy and community organizations, championed and passed the Energy Transition Act. It was widely hailed as a landmark legislation because it established 100% coal-free by 2040 energy production standard for the state. The governor also issued an executive order to establish a statewide greenhouse emissions reduction target. And here I will talk about how we, Center for Civic Policy, formed our People of Color-led coalition of community groups who organize in tribal communities and oil and gas country. As the ETA was being advanced out of the concern for that disproportionately impacted communities in New Mexico would be left behind in the transition away from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, my organization convened the Power for New Mexico Coalition. Power for New Mexico approaches power building by centering Black, Indigenous, people of color communities in our organizing, policy advocacy, and civic engagement work, and by using a racial and gender equity lens in all our strategic decisions in order to achieve transformative change for our communities. Through our efforts, we were able to ensure the landmark legislation, the Energy Transition Act, included funding and the mandate for our state's labor department to conduct the New Mexico Clean Energy Workforce Development Study, to examine the opportunities and barriers in renewable energy industry for disproportionately impacted communities across the state. This study was no small feat. It was conducted during the height of the pandemic and at the very bottom of the oil and gas industry slump. As a proud member of Okeowinge Pueblo, I can say the study itself is an important snapshot of the economic pain and suffering that our communities feel and the resilience, perseverance, and unity that are some of our greatest traits. Across the state, community members told us that they want a better future for their families, fueled by a long-term transition to an economy that is regenerative and not based on exploitation. Young New Mexicans told us that they want to stay in their communities, but they lack access to training and education programs. Rural New Mexicans who were laid off or furloughed this last year said they feared that new industry would not be built in their communities. That study led to the state's first transition legislation, which establishes, as I've mentioned, the Sustainable Economy Task Force and is required to implement findings from our study. Other aspects of the legislation ensure that disproportionately impacted communities have many seats at the table to chart long-term economic prosperity that does not destroy our climate or our environment. Many of the policies and practices that may come out of the task force and through the implementation of our study include greater access to training and education programs for jobs in renewable energy, community ownership in renewable energy infrastructure, continued modernization of the state electricity grid, bridging the high-speed or no-speed internet divide, mapping tools to ensure that renewable energy projects and other projects account for racial and economic equity, an examination of our state's procurement code to identify ways in which renewable energy projects may prioritize tribal and frontline communities, and create inroads that encourage that entrepreneurship among Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities is encouraged. Equity principles that ensure engagement of frontline communities and building capacity among frontline communities to participate in the long-term policy planning. I will also note in conclusion that our other legislation that Center for Civic Policy supports includes the Thrive Act, which invests in clean energy, energy efficiency, clean energy infrastructure, a slew of other important items, and was originally championed by our former Congresswoman and current Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is something that we support. Thank you for your time, and I'm going to end here so that our final panelists may be able to speak.
Thank you so much, James. We've been so impressed to see the work you and so many others have led in New Mexico. You know, we just need more places looking to you and the state's community of color-led coalitions. I mean, especially given the oil and gas industry's longtime presence in New Mexico, it's been really impressive the way y'all have brought so many different communities together. So lastly, we have Alyssa Macy, who is CEO of Washington Environmental Council and Washington Conservation Voters. And she'll be discussing Washington State's HEAL Act that will, for the first time, codify investments for frontline and overburdened communities into state law. And she'll be talking about how it will shape the state's recently passed climate bills and to really ensure that Washington State targets investments to the communities who need it most. And with that, I'll let you kick it off, Alyssa.
Thank you, Nick. Atukti Wigwa, Aini Manaimuma, Wanisha, Alyssa Macy, Tananawit, Wasco, Navajo, Hopi, Shitaikini, Ashwa. Hello, my name is Alyssa Macy. I am the CEO of Washington Environmental Council, Washington Conservation Voters. I've been serving in this role since January of 2020 and relocated to Seattle from the Warm Springs Indian Reservation where I grew up. I am very happy to be here today to talk about the Healthy Environment for All Act, the HEAL Act that passed in Washington in this last legislative session. To get started, I wanted to give some background on the HEAL Act because this has been in the works for a while now. In 2019, the HEAL Act was introduced as legislation by Senator Rebecca Saldana from the 37th District and Representative Christine Reeves from the 30th. The overall effort was led by Front and Center, an organization that consists of a number of community-based organizations around the state. So they're like an umbrella organization. And WEC, WCV played a role in supporting the work with lobbying, with policy, budget know-how, working with the legislators that we have existing relationships with, and also the governor's office, and also amplifying communications and field work of Front and Center. The bill originally directed agencies to incorporate a health disparities map, which is managed by the Department of Health, into their work at implementing policy, prioritizing projects for funding, and engagement in communities in the public processes. So it's a really amazing tool that gives you a lot of data overlays. You can look at the state and figure out pretty quickly where environmental degradation is impacting certain communities. So it's a really excellent tool. The original bill was not a hard mandate, but it faced some opposition. We didn't have a very large environmental majority, and there were fewer legislators of color in the that we had then than we do now. So things have changed since 2019. Ultimately, what happened in 2019 was the bill died, but we were able to secure a budget proviso for a 2-year environmental justice task force to regroup, to keep the building, keep the momentum going, and engage with more communities directly. And the task force met in locations across the state and took public input at every step of the way. I think it's important to note, I am a tribal member, so I care very deeply about tribal issues, and I track those very closely. In the Environmental Justice Task Force process, there wasn't any tribal engagement. And by that, I mean no one from a tribal community in Washington or any other tribal community actually served on that task force. So there were some good things that came out of it, but there were definitely some pieces in there that should and could have been improved in the process. Fast forwarding to 2021, the HEAL Act was reintroduced by Senator Saldana and Representative Deborah Lakanoff. Representative Reeves had left the legislature to run for Congress, so it wasn't introduced by that individual. Front and Center continued to lead the effort, and the bill had critical political buy-in right out of the gate. So we came into this, everybody part of the coalition, with a lot of excitement and anticipation for the passage of this. There were 3 key priorities that were identified in the House and the Senate for the 2021 session, and those were addressing the pandemic, racial justice, and climate action. And the HEAL Act connected to all 3 of these priorities. The version of the HEAL Act that passed this year was stronger than what we saw in 2019. So in addition to mandating the requirements on how the health disparity map should be used, and requirements for accessibility and cultural competency for public meetings that was in the original bill, it also established a new 14-person Environmental Justice Council, which has a role to engage with agencies and provide some level of oversight on the work that is conducted. There are 2 seats on that task force that are specifically for tribal nations in the state of Washington. I think, again, as I mentioned, there were some different things going on in 2019 as they were in 2020. I think one of the things that we're very excited about is the definition of environmental justice has been codified in the state, and that's been a really, I think, positive thing. We have followed the guidance of the task force and really changing some of the language that we use around impacted communities or frontline communities. And the one thing that I thought was super interesting about the report that came out was the language of overburdened communities, not using frontline, not using those most impacted, but talking about communities with that lens, overburdened, thinking about environmental injustices and how they lay upon impacted communities, tribal nations, urban areas, as being not just like you're impacted, but you are actually overburdened with what's happening in your state, what's happening in the environmental space that we all are existing in. So I thought that was a really important change in language that has occurred here in the state of Washington. So tribal nations are sovereign nations, and there are 29 federally recognized tribes in the state of Washington. So while they are have 2 seats on the Environmental Justice Task Force, by no means does that take away from any direct government-to-government consultation on any type of legislation or action by the state. So I think that's important to state. Wanted to just talk a little bit about the Climate Commitment Act as well, because that ties into what happened with the HEAL Act. So putting a price on carbon has been in play for more than a decade, reaching back to our previous governor. It has been a recognized priority in order to address both emissions economy-wide and to generate revenue. There have been several efforts to pass a cap and trade policy very similar to California's policy. As an organization, WEC and WCV stepped back from legislative efforts in 2014 and refocus our efforts on building a broad coalition to ultimately go to the ballot box with an initiative. As part of this work, we were deeply invested in coalition and frontline EJ organizations and building relationships with labor union. We navigated an initiative that was a carbon neutral carbon tax and stuck with our coalition and ran a carbon tax initiative 1631 in 2018. And I know Nick was involved while he was living in Washington on that effort. As an organization, we have done a lot of learning in this space, navigating 2 different initiatives, growing in our organizational commitment and knowledge to environmental justice work, learning about tribal sovereignty and tribal engagement, and most importantly, growing in our own role and engaging in addressing and incorporating environmental justice into our work. It is not the work of just us as a large environmental organization in the state of Washington. It is the job of all environmental organizations here in Washington to do the work and to really, I think, adjust how we engage and listen to communities and actually center what is coming from the community. I think this is the work of all environmental organizations, especially historically white-led environmental organizations. We've got a big responsibility to do what's morally and ethically right, and that is to listen more, talk less, and to make sure that we are actually incorporating what communities are saying. So in 2021, we had 2 competing approaches that came through: a carbon tax, a green bond bill, and a cap and invest program. And the coalition landscape that we were working in was very dynamic and very complex. So we came out and we said, we are going to stay at the table and we are going to engage in both bills and improve them. We had some of our environmental partners that preferred a cap and invest, and we had front and centered who strongly opposed cap and invest and supported the carbon tax instead. So our primary partners, front and centered, and our environmental partners had different views on what they thought was the best approach to this. We stayed at the table for a couple of reasons. The first and foremost, all of the positions that the environmental community and front and centered and others were taking were, I think, good positions to take. I don't disagree with anybody where they stood on the issue. The issue that we had organizationally was that tribal nations were not a part of any conversation about a no or a yes to support. And so part of our strategy was to spend a lot of time listening and engaging with tribal nations around both the cap and trade bill and the carbon tax bill. So that, as you know, working with tribal nations, working anything through tribal leadership or tribal governance takes time. So tribal nations will typically not engage until there seems to be some action happening on something, just for the sake of efficiency. If you've ever worked for a tribe or had to take something in front of a tribe, you know that you better come with close to being done with what you're asking, because they're not going to want to talk to you multiple times about it. We also worked very closely with the Washington Alliance for Black Lives Matter and Build Back Black. This is part of our organizational commitment that we have made through our new strategic framework to spend and focus our efforts on tribal nations and Black-led movements. And so we were spending a lot of time just engaging, sharing information about both of the bills in different coalition spaces. We ultimately created a criteria to help navigate and focus our advocacy in this space, which included explicitly areas of how and where the policy addresses priorities for different frontline communities, upholds tribal sovereignty, and invests in communities. And we learned a lot from California's mistakes, learned from community experts around air pollution issues, and learned from tribal nations about their priorities. In summary, the Climate Commitment Act establishes an economy-wide cap and trade program that is tied to achieving our GHG emission limits of ultimately getting to net zero by 2050, and creates the benchmarks along the way to track the 2030 and 2040 limits with a declining cap system. It has the key elements of a standard program, capping emissions across the economy, establishing allowances for covered entities which generate revenue, and enabling offsets. And this policy has a groundbreaking and critical elements to take lessons from California's program and to integrate lessons from our work on this issue for over a decade, fundamentally getting at a longer-term priorities around community engagement, addressing air quality, and upholding tribal sovereignty. This is a policy that will be felt throughout the state of Washington and includes, it incorporates explicit provisions to reduce air pollution like particulates in frontline communities, and the funding of a monitoring system that has been a barrier to doing this work effectively. It utilizes the Environmental Justice Council that was established by the HEAL Act, this 14-person council, to review and adaptively manage the program. It also puts representatives from tribal nations and communities that are overburdened with pollution in leadership roles. In addition to the 14 seats that are on that EJ Council, it adds 2 more individuals from tribal nations for the CCA monitoring and implementation. So there'll actually be 4 tribal representatives on that EJ Council. It also ensures offsets are under the cap. It directs the revenue to 3 primary buckets: transportation, requiring that transportation investments to reduce carbon pollution with up to $5.2 billion over the first 16 years. The climate commitment investments also has 2 different buckets, one around emissions reductions generally from land use, buildings, and more, and one to invest in natural climate solutions. In this category, this is a requirement that at least 35% of the revenue to be directed to overburdened communities, and at least 10% of the revenue be directed to tribal nation priorities, something that was specifically built into 1631. Finally, there's a $20 million each biennium to the air quality and health disparities improvements, including the fund to monitor the network. So when we started in the 2021 legislative session, I'll be honest, we were very excited about HEAL, not really thinking too much about putting a price on carbon. It didn't seem like it was realistic in this legislative session. And so we were really focused on other priorities when we started out. This really started to come into play about halfway session. And we were committed to, of course, working on the HEAL Act with front and centered, incorporating environmental justice in our legislative policy work across the board. And I think one of the things that we learned organizationally is the environmental justice movement here in the state of Washington is doing some phenomenal things. But like all movements, we all have the room to grow. And I think one of the areas of growth that needs to happen here in Washington state is around engagement with tribal nations. As a person who has worked on behalf of my own nation as a chief operation officer and as a political appointee, I am very aware of how policy at the state level, policy gets developed by nonprofit partners and others that are well-intended, but don't actually engage with leadership from tribal nations. So I think we've learned an important lesson. Tribes supported the cap and invest policy at a level that they haven't supported before in the state of Washington, came together as an extraordinarily strong coalition. Build Back Black and the Washington Alliance for Black Lives Matter also came in as key partners in passing this. So it was a very unusual, I think, coming together of different folks. And I say that because as an environmental organization that has been working in the state for 80 plus years between EC and CV, we haven't done work like this before. I have been pushing very strongly with our staff around our engagement with tribes because I think it's important. I think it is morally and ethically right. When you were talking to and talking about the lands, territories, and resources, you absolutely must engage with the original stewards of the land, and that is the tribes here in Washington state. And I will close by saying we have done some really great work. There's more work to be done. It was an exciting, stressful, very intense legislative session. I still feel like we're debriefing and learning, but we know that the work doesn't stop here, that we actually have a ton of work to do when it comes to implementation and making sure that these pieces of legislation do what they said they were going to do. And I really Look forward to seeing how the work of the Environmental Justice Task Force plays out and how they work to represent interests of frontline communities and overburdened communities in this process, not only for these pieces of legislation, but for all of the work that's done here in Washington State.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. As you alluded to, I used to work in Washington and know how long the road has been to get here to really become one of the strongest states in the country on climate. And it's so clear Washington's chosen to go far and go together. And I just wanted to thank you for your commitment to pass so many vital policies with tribal nations and communities of color in Washington this past year. So yeah, thank you all for everything you talked about. Like we said, we think these are such vital policies that show the massive transition that's happening across the country that's really been led by states, and really represents a clear model for Congress as they're considering climate and environmental policies that could pass Congress this year. So a couple of things as we move into the question portion here. If you do have a question for our panelists, if you could please just state who you would like to direct the question to and enter your question into the Q&A chat that's on your screen. And we'll be able to call on you to ask the question. You can also just raise your hand and we can call on you if you'd like to do it that way as well. So yeah, again, if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A box. We did have a couple come in already, so I'm going to go ahead and just ask those now. Alyssa, this one was directed to you, but I think all three of our panelists could answer this, so I'll let you go with it first, but if other folks want to chime in as well, we would love to hear from you. And just wanted to hear, how do you think your state's policy would translate to a national model? And I think talking about the HEAL Act here, but I think that could also be applied to Climate Commitment Act that you talked about as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, we are in a time in this country where we can no longer ignore the voices of overburdened communities. And I think if anything has happened, you know, one of the greatest lessons I feel like I've learned in the last year is that everything, the weaknesses of this country, of our society, of our social safety nets has been daylighted in a way that we can never unsee. Like you will never unsee what we are seeing today. People of color have been asking, demanding, raising concerns to organizations like ours, to other environmental organizations, to the state for decades. This has been going on for a really long time. People just have not listened. So when you look at something like the HEAL Act, what you're seeing is a collective of people coming together saying, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. We have power and we are going to organize in a way to move legislation forward. I am very excited about that because I feel like there's a tremendous amount of knowledge in overburdened communities that nobody has been listening to. There have been good ideas that have been coming forward for a very long time that have fallen on deaf ears. Now I feel like people are listening, but this is a listening that should have happened back in the 90s when people started talking about environmental justice, right? Like we should have been listening then. As a Native woman, you know, I don't consider myself to be an environmental person, like an environmentalist. I look at myself as being a person that's connected to the land that my people come from and willing to do the work to make sure that it is protected for future generations. I feel like other people of color also have that same sort of connection and care very deeply about what's happening around them. So I think in terms of a national model, there is a way that states should be working with overburdened communities. We hear a lot of rhetoric coming from organizations about centering Black and Brown voices. Now is the time to actually put that into action. I think the HEAL Act puts this into action in a way that's codified at the state level, that is law. So now you have to do it. So let's get into the dirty, the messiness of trying to figure out how to operationalize this, how to look at it. I think it is one path that we can follow here, anywhere in the state, or anywhere in the country, about how to actually do that. I don't think it's perfect. Again, you know, there were some things that I was concerned about, the lack of tribal nation engagement, but I do think it's an important model. And I was very excited to hear about the New Jersey executive order and the law that has been passed as well. I'm always kind of looking for ideas. When it comes to putting a price on carbon, there are very strong feelings about that. different feelings about it. You know, I go back to the work that was done with the tribal nations as being the original stewards of the land here, their tremendous support stepping forward, the opportunities for us to further engage and bring together communities of color and tribal nations. That's an opportunity here in the state of Washington. We can do that better. And also pulling in and lifting up Black-led movements. I think that is a really important thing that needs to happen as well. And we have made organizationally that commitment to focus time, energy, and resources on engaging with those two communities. So cap and trade, carbon tax, I think that states will decide and communities will decide what is the best path forward. I think it's good to have multiple paths to go from point A to point B, to try different things to see if it works. We think we have a better model than California. We could be wrong, but at least we're going to make an effort to actually do that. So I think in terms of which path you choose, I really feel like that's something that communities need to decide. I'm not quite sure putting a price on carbon will ever be a national priority or could actually move. I think there are lots of different ideas on what is the best approach, but multiple paths from point A to point B, and we are trying this one, and I'm hopeful that it is a success. And we will be more than happy to share what we're learning in the process with other folks as we go through the rule setting and actually see how this gets implemented here in Washington.
James, Olivia, do you have anything you want to note on how your state's policies could be translated to a national level?
I can certainly build upon that. And I think that Alyssa's responses were just so right on and so deeply resonant. Also, Nick, too, which you mentioned a little earlier, you said, I think the phrase was, go far, go together. And that really underscores how you really gain the greatest ground when we go together. In New Jersey, even before the passage of the law, we had already made the connections with environmental justice coordinators all around the country, with a big thanks to the EPA's national headquarters. So we were able to share that progress. And since the passage of the law, we've already been involved in a number of conversations with over a half dozen states already. And more appointments scheduled and follow-up appointments scheduled to continue these conversations. I think the deep replicability of it is what communities have been asking for decades, just to be heard, just to have a seat at the table. And when you have concurrence between government and the citizens that we are here to serve, you can only go farther together. So I really think that's what underscores the progress right now.
Nick, I don't have a whole lot to add because Alyssa's answer and Olivia's answers were so robust, and I completely agree with both of them. I would say the only thing that I would emphasize is early consultation with directly impacted communities, meaningful input, and for our allies in the broader environmental movement, the obligation that white-led organizations have to providing the knowledge and background that they have to directly impacted communities so that people of color, that BIPOC community are the folks who are educated and the leaders in their own experience in finding those solutions.
All right, we have another question come in here, and this is directed to Commissioner Glenn, but again, I think it's another one that all three of you could provide some really great insight on. And we were hoping that you could talk about how you've seen shifts in focus on environmental justice from voters, and if you think this is something that voters are more concerned about now. Is it something that still kind of needs a lot of work with the public? Wanted to see if you could shed some light on that in New Jersey.
Yeah, I think that there's a great deal of interest in environmental justice and a great deal of social justice. So in New Jersey, in addition to being the nation's most densely populated state, we are also the fourth most diverse state in the nation. So we are truly a melting pot. So when you look at who comprises New Jerseyans, certainly we see a reflection of all communities in our state. And so when we're talking about trying to mitigate the burdens that some communities experience more than others, it definitely resounds with our voters. And I think that for us, this public health emergency really underscored and illuminated some of the disparities that exist. So it's not that they didn't exist before, but I think it became much more tangible for all of us to see, because at that point in time last year, we were all, pretty much completely sitting at home and working from home as much as we could. So then you add to that the dynamics that happened on a social platform just a little over a year ago with George Floyd. And I think that everyone was just hungry to do what they could to do the right thing. And I remember when the bill was brought to the floor of the New Jersey legislature, one of our assemblymen said, look, when you don't know better, you don't do better. But when you know better, you have to do better. And I think that his just deeply passionate words may have brought some people who were on the fences, who may have had some other interests, telling them that perhaps they needed to make some more modifications to that law before they considered its passage, moved by their conscience. And I think that they knew that their voters who sent them there were going to support that, as well as our governor, who took a huge leap last year before the bill even made it to be voted upon by the legislature. He publicly declared his support for it, because it was clear that in New Jersey, we're looking to make our state stronger, fairer, and greener. So the energy is definitely here. I do think one of the things we need to be deeply mindful of, it weighs on me, is making sure that we're doing more to build capacity across our entire state. We were very intentional with this law not to focus on just the huge urbanized centers like Camden, Newark, Trenton, Patterson, and others. We wanted to reach even our rural communities, Western Warren County, Sussex County, and the like, Cumberland County. So there are 331 out of New Jersey's 565 municipalities that have overburdened communities within their borders. That's huge. And I mean, that goes back to us being the fourth most diverse state in the nation. So as we're trying to move forward with that legislation, with the rulemaking process, we're trying to think about ways that we continue to build capacity in our communities. So it's not just this heart commitment and this just conviction about knowing what's right and wrong. It's also knowing how to be civically engaged once these rules are in place so that they can truly have a seat at the table.
Thanks so much for that. I wrote down, I'm gonna have to remember, when you know better, you have to do better. I think that's such an important thing to remember. Alyssa and James, do either of you have anything you want to add on how you've seen support for environmental justice shift over time in Washington and New Mexico?
Sure. I really think I again, very much agree with what Olivia said. And, I think that it's about the economy and messaging. And, there is a great deal of interest I've seen in our state, in New Mexico, around conservation, the environment, and energy. But what interests people the most is how it impacts their wallet, and it impacts all of us. And I think as advocates, as we learn to message to our constituents in that way, we continue to build the movement.
Yes to everything that's been said. I love the statement about working in rural communities. Washington is a huge state, so it's really important for us to also be engaging in other parts of the state with communities that are there. Also, yes to the economy. I think when we figure out how things hit our pocketbooks, then we start to care. I think in the Pacific Northwest, the one thing that I know is very obvious to everybody wherever you live is wildfire. When we have fires and you have to breathe the smoke, then all of a sudden you start to care about the trees and things like that. And last year we had a very bad season, in addition to a global pandemic, not being able to go outside and do that sort of thing, because that was at that time really your only escape from where you were living, right, was to be outside. We were not able for parts of the summer to go outside because of smoke. And so I think that there's a changing view of climate change because people from all socioeconomic levels, from all communities across the state of Washington, are seeing that in a very real way. It is very dry here already in the Pacific Northwest in Washington and Oregon. There have already been wildfires that have been happening in the gorge on I-84. Yesterday was a report. So I feel like climate change is starting to touch people's lives in very real ways. And unfortunately, it takes that, I think, to motivate people to actually care. That combined with everything that happened in 2020, I think is getting people to really realize that you can't talk about the health of this planet without talking about the health of this community, that they are in fact interrelated, and that we as people are part of this ecosystem. And as we pull and tug at different parts of the ecosystem, we're seeing the impacts. And I feel like there's this change in worldview maybe. It feels like it's in alignment with how tribal people view the world as being part of, not something that's separate. And I think that's really good. I think it has a lot to do with the messaging. I also think it has a lot to do with folks finally listening to tribes and realizing that tribes actually have a lot of important knowledge to help with climate change issues. And that feels exciting and long overdue. So I think the conversation about environmental justice is not going to go away. I think it's going to get stronger and more organized as more people start to make that connection between the health of the ecosystem, of this planet, of the ultimate Mother Earth, to things like housing, to clean air, to having a living wage job, to clean energy, to all those pieces. Like, it's there, it's always been there. People are finally just have their eyes open enough and their ears open enough to actually see it. So I'm excited about the future because I think we are at a time where we're going to be able to do great things across the country.
With that, we finished exactly on time here, which is incredibly impressive and probably the first time for me doing one of these. We've been able to do that. So I just want to say thank you again to you three for taking the time to talk about this and sharing such important things that I think people can learn all across the country. And thank you to everyone who was able to jump on and listen to us. Like we said, we will have a recording of this that we'll be sending out, and hope to talk to you all again really soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.